Right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the latest serving of the InSport webinar series. We've got a jam-packed full agenda to go through with you this afternoon or this morning or this evening, wherever you're dialing in from. We've got a stellar lineup of guests, and I'm not going to do them any disservice by trying to introduce them myself. I'm going to let them introduce themselves one at a time, if that's okay. Bring them all on screen. So, folks, if you could just give us a quick update on who you are, what you do, and then I'll start on the webinar. So if we come to Rowena first, please.
Thanks very much, Rob. Hi, everyone. My name is Rowena Samarasinha. I am a sports lawyer and a commercial consultant. My background is very much agency side. I spent about 15 years selling sponsorship and broadcasting rights for international federations. Very interested in the investment angle and what this means. So hoping to, really excited about this panel, and thanks for having me, Rob.
Brilliant. Thanks, Ro. And then over to you, Faye.
Hi, I'm Faye Carruthers. I'm a broadcaster, predominantly working for TalkSport and Sky Sports as well. I've been in the industry for about 20 years now, and definitely one of the biggest stories, this one, that I've covered in a long while.
Good stuff. Thanks, Faye. And then over to you, Tim.
Yeah, so for years I worked at Sky. The last few, from about 2013 to 2018, I led a lot of our sports rights valuation work, and since then I've left, and I'm a consultant in media and media rights valuation.
Perfect, great to have you. So you've got some good insights in broadcast and where that might go after this week. And then a very, very good friend of mine, Kieran Maguire, in a very, very tame shirt today. We were just discussing off screen that he's normally wearing a much louder shirt, but he's got his Price of Football book in the background. Kieran, a couple of words about you, please.
I'm a jumped up teacher, apparently, and I focus on the analysis and interpretation of football club and industry financial statements.
Brilliant. Thanks, Kieran. So, as I said earlier, folks, a stellar panel, lots of experience in the sport industry, lots of experience around the broadcast and the finance investment landscape. But before we get into some of the future directions, and that's really where we're going to try and go through today, is the what's next for the European football landscape, how we're going to deal with the fallout of what we've heard this week. And actually, was there any good or were there any good opportunities within that European Super League framework that we could all learn from with regard to the future of European football? So before we get there, I'm just going to invite Faye to give us a quick rundown, a potted history of what's happened this week, and I guess a sense of feeling that we're probably all aware of, actually, having read a lot, watched a lot of the television over the last week. But what's your sense, Faye? What's happened? What's the sense of feeling, and where are we up to just now?
Well, the sense of feeling is just as strong as it was on Sunday when these reports first came out. And ironically, I was at the Emirates watching Arsenal, currently at the time when the news came out, trailing to Fulham by 1-0. They eventually got the equaliser, but the fact that they were associated with this league when that was happening, and the season that they've had, was a source of quite a lot of amusement and frustration by many people, for sure. And as the kind of day continued, the Premier League came out with a statement early on in the afternoon, condemning the proposal, attacking the principles of open competition and sporting merit. Then a joint statement from UEFA, all the FAs, England, Spain and Italy, Premier League, La Liga, Serie A as well, trying to stop what they called the cynical project. And then Gary Neville, I think, was the big shift change in the evening game. I think it was Manchester United Burnley, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Coming out with that, claiming that the Big Six should be relegated if they sign up, calling the project a disgrace and a criminal act against football fans in this country. Now, when somebody like Gary Neville comes out quite vociferously against something like that, you sit up and listen. And I think football fans watching that, because a lot of the time there are a lot of headlines that come out and people don't really understand what's going on behind it. But the more you see big names get behind it, social media, big games that people are watching, the more anger builds. And the anger very, very quickly built on Twitter. Obviously, I work at TalkSport. I was at the game for TalkSport. The phone lines were just rammed with people, particularly fans of the big six clubs. And this is, I think, what was the most significant, is that they were furious about it. Rather than it just being the football family, if you like, the other 14 clubs in the Premier League and smaller clubs down the pyramid being outraged, fans of the big six were outraged by it. And that was really crucial for what came out for the rest of the week, because I think the owners seriously misjudged the mood to come out with something like this towards the end of a pandemic. You question the timings anyway, with the UEFA meeting on the Monday anyway. But to seriously misjudge their fan base was a big, big error. And there's going to be a lot of climb downing having to happen. By the Monday, you've got Joel Glazer, United co-chairman, coming out and saying it's a new chapter. Well, that's not going to go down particularly well. And then really the president was down, talking about some of the orchestrators, calling them greedy. Then there was the Premier League meeting of the 14 clubs who weren't part of this project. We'd seen the likes of Steve Parish from Crystal Palace coming out and speaking out against it, and various others as well. The Duke of Cambridge, who's the president of the FA, coming out with his worries about the football community. And then the big one on Monday night was Jurgen Klopp. So someone actually involved within one of these big six clubs coming out and saying he didn't agree with it, which he'd said back in 2019, he didn't agree with any kind of European Super League. So had he straight batted, which is not something Jurgen Klopp would do anyway, you would have expected there would be quite a lot of backlash over that. And he didn't, he just addressed it head on, as did James Milner in his post-match interview afterwards. And when you have people like that against their own club and what the club are doing, and also very significantly saying they knew nothing about it until the news had come out on Sunday, that then makes fans even more angry and on board. And it feels very much like an us against them, in terms of us against these greedy owners, if you like. Then it kind of, continued into the Tuesday. Florentino Perez of Real Madrid obviously did his interview very late on the Monday night, I think it was, very hidden in a random Spanish television station, but basically saying that expulsion from the Champions League wouldn't happen, claiming the law protects them. And by the way, if you fast forward to today, that is actually true. They are going to be competing in the Champions League still, which we kind of expected to happen. Everton then jumped in. I know there's some Everton fans on this call for sure, talking about preposterous arrogance and betraying supporters. Gianni Infantino from FIFA then getting himself involved. And then the government finally step in on their white horse to come and save the day. Boris Johnson basically saying no action by the government's off the table in trying to block this project. Then you get Pep Guardiola again talking about the sporting merit. Now, he didn't go anywhere near as far as Jurgen Klopp did, but he basically talked about the competition element of it, and that's much more Pep than Klopp, I would say. And then it just continued like that. Again, Tuesday was the busiest day probably. The 14 Premier League clubs rejecting it, unanimously and vigorously were the words. Then Captain Jordan Henderson, Liverpool's captain, comes out to tweet exactly what James Milner had said. We don't like it and we don't want it to happen. And that's our collective position. And then the big news that Manchester United confirm Ed Woodward's going to be stepping down from his role at the end of 2021 as well. Then the dominoes. Well, I likened it on Twitter to Jenga blocks being pulled out, wobbly, each like of them, and the whole thing just going down on Tuesday night, because then we'd heard rumours that Chelsea were looking at coming out, and they perhaps hadn't been, at the forefront of these negotiations in the first place, and Manchester City as well. So they confirmed they were pulling out. Then about an hour before midnight on Tuesday, Manchester United, Liverpool, Arsenal and Tottenham announced the end of their involvement. Chelsea officially a little bit later on, talking about it not being in the best interests of the club, the supporters and the wider community. And then on Wednesday morning, the Liverpool owner, John W. Henry, posted a video message, absolutely unheard of. You just don't see or hear from him ever, taking full responsibility for the disruption caused and apologising for letting the fans down. Then outside of Europe, Atletico Madrid went, Inter Milan went, AC Milan went. And Joel Glazer released an open letter saying Manchester United apologise unreservedly for the unrest caused. Now, I found that quite interesting, actually, and I'd love the panel's thoughts on that as well, because it feels as if these apologies were very much, they apologised for the disruption and they apologised for the unrest, as opposed to apologising for wanting to dismantle what we all know as football. And that's quite telling. I think in PR terms, they got it drastically wrong. They've completely underestimated fans and disrespected them a lot. And I think this is going to have major repercussions in the future. And I tried as much as possible to keep that ridiculous week that's gone on in the media to as brief as possible. So I hope I kind of bookended it enough. But yeah, that's where we're at the moment.
You did a really, really sterling job of a potted history, actually. There's a number of threads that we're going to start pulling on now, though. Kieran, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay, because you obviously run the Price of Football podcast. I know you had a fairly extensive discussion yesterday about this. So, just based on what Faye said, and to try and move this conversation now into some of the rationale that was designed to promote the benefit of a Super League. What's been the reaction for you and the Price of Football listeners, and how do you see this unfolding over the next few weeks?
I think it has been clearly a fairly comprehensive rejection of the project. The people who were in favour of it were coming from different angles. The finances of Real Madrid and Barcelona were poor prior to COVID, and therefore those clubs were in desperate need of cash. The advance from JP Morgan was a way of addressing that. The main owners, in terms of the profitable clubs of the Premier League, Arsenal, Manchester United, Liverpool and Spurs, they saw this as an opportunity to boost their profits, because increased revenues, guaranteed revenues as far as they were concerned, is fantastic. And also the idea of a salary cap, more money coming in, less money going out, that's fine. There are fundamental structural issues across the whole of European football, and certainly English football, in terms of an inability to run clubs as a sensible business. The gaps both within divisions, which would have been amplified as a result of this proposal for this franchise league, and within divisions have been systematic for many years, and they would have continued. So it was an opportunity, COVID, to put forward the plans to increase the value and the wealth of a few clubs. The justification was similar to Reaganomics, trickle-down economics, that some monies would therefore go to the smaller clubs. And I think if we've been played like a piano, which some people cynically say that we have, what has resulted in is the acceptance of the Swiss model for 2024-25 and onwards for the Champions League, which itself is a grotesque Frankenstein of a tournament, whereby it takes us 180 games to narrow 36 teams down to 24, and it doesn't encourage participation in Europe's senior competition from a huge number of the countries in Europe.
Just going to pick that up, actually. Faye mentioned open competition and the benefits of open competition, and you've kind of explored that just there in your narrative about the importance of that open competition, the fact that competition integrity is so important to the fabric of the game, if you like. And I think one of the things that struck me over the past week was that sense of injustice through all of those fans, whether they were fans of the 12 clubs involved or indeed fans of some of those domestic clubs, and the fact that football was going to be almost stolen away from them in the spirit of competition. And of course, what underwrites a lot of this narrative is the volume of cash that you can produce through certain sporting competitions. I'm going to come to Tim, if it's okay, because the idea behind this is very much centralized on big broadcasting, big TV deals, and supporting clubs that you've just expressed there, Kieran, and trying to generate that recovery from COVID, which is, I think, is where Perez was trying to take things. I'm not so sure I agree with him, for the record. But Tim, from a broadcasting perspective, would a European Super League really generate the benefits that we were being told it would do, or at least it was being alluded to by some of these Big 12 clubs? Or do you think there's a slightly different tack that broadcasters need to have taken?
Well, I think you've got a couple of issues. One is you just take the customer side, so the football fan side, and there's no question that football fans over the last few years are feeling more and more resentment about having to have multiple services and paying more and more for football because of that. And then, all but the hardest core fans will tell you they've already got enough football to watch, which would then suggest if something like European Super League came along, they would be in the situation of, one of the competitions is going to suffer and suffer badly because people just don't have time to watch more football than they already are watching. And I think you've got then on the broadcaster side, you've got essentially two types of companies that buy rights, three types of companies that buy rights, free-to-air companies, so people like BBC, ITV, who can really only afford the secondary rights. Then you've got the big traditional pay TV companies, so BT, Sky, and those companies are facing massive OTT competition, not just from a sports point of view, but actually more from an entertainment point of view. They're under a lot of pricing pressure. They don't really have the ability to raise prices and assume that they're going to be able to keep those customers. So, and so adding another big right to their portfolio, again, something's going to have to come out. And if you think about BT, who sits there with Champions League, they might want to swap it out. BT's come out and said they're not, committed to sports and TV like they used to be, but they want to keep the Champions League. But ultimately, they're contracted through 23-24 on that deal. And if, and so they would essentially be out if European football started before 24-25. So they wouldn't even be involved in that bidding competition because they don't really focus on TV and sports broadcasting anymore. And then you've got the OTT side. And I think the challenge from the OTT side, although we'll see with the DAZN Serie A deal that's happened in Italy, but ultimately, if you've got a Sky getting 60 or 80 pounds per customer out of each of their sports customers, a DAZN can't charge that kind of money. So they're going to need a lot more customers to cover their costs. And then there's a real question about, is there that many fans that are going to buy into what looks like an attractive but is an unproven property out there?
Yeah, some really interesting points there. It's interesting, we've heard this week, this is kind of interrelationship almost between the term fans and the term customers. And I think that gets to the nub of some of what Faye and Kieran were talking about. And you talked there, Tim, about the importance of being able to sell those products, whatever they look like and however they're carved up and whatever sort of digital assets are created, but to sell that to customers, or in this case, the fans. And Rowena and I were talking off screen just before this started about the fact that in this whole picture of the European Super League, the one group of people that haven't been consulted are the customers of all of these all of these major service providers. So, Ro, what do you think? Why haven't we seen a discussion with fans groups or the customer groups, the mainstay of these clubs? Do you think were the major clubs fearful of what they might want to do, or how might they have involved them in a bit more detail?
I mean, it's really quite amazing. I mean, Faye touched on it before, like how this could have happened in this way. Whether it was a plan of attack that they wanted to take UEFA by surprise, whether they wanted to keep it closed shop. But it is very strange that when you're introducing such wide-ranging changes, not to have had a detailed consultation process. I mean, it felt like even not just the fans. It felt like even when Klopp came out, it felt like most of the working staff had no idea what was going on. It really was sort of this decision that was made at the top level without really any consideration for anyone else, really. And that's what really is really strange about this. And when you think about having like a major investment house like JP Morgan Chase getting involved in this, it just feels really strange that there wouldn't have been a really strong proposition behind this, a solid growth plan and more to it. And I think that's what I felt really was a bit bizarre about the statement that came out. It was so brief. We just weren't told anything about it. We were told that it was going to encourage high quality football, but not really how it would happen, and how those solidarity payments, they were going to be greater than UEFA's, but not really. There was just no guidance on what it was going to do. And I think this was the real problem, that it just wasn't communicated. And so then what it did show is that first and foremost, although football is a business and sport, we work in this business of sport, and we're trying to bring in money and professionalize it. Really, what was the proven case here is that amid all this craziness, actually, first of all, football is a passion, and secondly, it's a business. And I just think that was really overlooked by the people making these decisions.
Yeah. Do you think that on that basis, I guess if we think back to 1992, just focus on the English Premier League for a moment, that the tenets behind that particular move were, as we've just described there, the game would become more exciting, the entertainment value would be increased, players would become fitter, they'd become faster, stronger, commercial values and opportunities would increase. Do you think we've almost seen the Premier League Mark II propositioned here without that consideration of the fans? Or do you think there was something else to it?
Well, I mean, the concept of the Super League isn't new. I mean, even the Super League's been talked about since the 1990s, and every time it's funny that the proposals have popped up, and then UEFA's sort of made some changes to the Champions League, and again going back to that point, whether it was tactical and whether the intention was to sort of put pressure on them from that perspective. But I always sort of think, we the consumers a little bit to blame, as we've sort of moved towards this need for short, sharp, concise, high quality content over quantity. Actually you can't, playing devil's advocate, you can't fault the concept. Actually all you're going to do is create this level of really top premium quality football, in theory. And so, are they answering this craving that we have, that actually we watch the derbies, we watch, we all tune into those games. So it's really difficult to say that this isn't new, and we see closed leagues work really well in the US. But I think the key point boils down to the fact that actually football is so steeped in tradition and it has roots in the community, that actually it's not just about, it really isn't just about winning. It is really about the whole process and involving everybody. And I think that's what was really missed in this.
Yeah. Faye, I'll come to you first and I'll bring Kieran in on the same point, but if you go, and then I've got a question for Kieran too.
I wanted to jump in on that actually, because it's not just the fans that have been missed out here. It's the players as well, the players' welfare, because they're already under an immense amount of pressure, playing ridiculous amounts of games in this concertinaed Premier League season in particular that we see at the moment. You bring the European competition into that as well. We've basically got some teams playing Tuesday, Thursday, Sunday regularly. Now, if you then, bearing in mind the number of games that were then touted with this, at a higher level, if you think about it allows managers to rotate, they're not going to want, a European Super League isn't going to want the top players not being involved in it. So there's player welfare that's been completely ignored in this case. And I think the players have started a little bit of discontent with that and I think it was Ilkay Gundogan came out and said something relating that, because they are ignored in all of this. And at the end of the day, they're the asset. And when you bring it round to a financial point of view, surely the players and their agents are going to be sitting there saying, well, if you want us playing these big, more high profile games, you need to pay us more money. And then we're going in this cycle again. And, that's been largely ignored, I think.
It's probably a nice segue there for you or I, Kieran, around that kind of the commodification of the player. What do you make of that?
I was actually really pleased that the players did come out and react, because Gary Neville himself said that when the Glazers originally arrived at Manchester United, I think the reaction of the players was, this isn't affecting us on a day-to-day basis, so therefore we're going to keep our mouths quiet. We don't feel comfortable about it. We do feel it's taking Manchester United away from its roots. And then, of course, the registration of Manchester United as a Cayman Islands company traded in New York, that's further distressing the fans, which led to the creation. Well, it's linked to the creation of FC United of Manchester as a protest movement. So I think it's great that players are now starting to articulate themselves, managers too, because they are employees, they are stakeholders in the game, and surely the most important people in football are the fans and the players, because they're the people we go to see, and they're the people who are most affected. Some of the proposals were not in the interests of players, and I can understand from an investing point of view. You've got guaranteed revenues under this project. You've got guaranteed profits to a certain extent, because there would have been a wage cap. There had been talk about not transferring players between Super League clubs to stop agents from having a similar situation to what we've had with Raiola in the past few weeks with Haaland, literally treating him as a commodity to be touted around the best clubs in Europe. So it's been an intriguing point of views that we've seen, intriguing behaviour. I guess ultimately it shows that billionaires aren't familiar with what happens on the terraces, which surely should come as no surprise to anyone.
No, I guess when you look at the ownership of some of these Big 12 clubs, absolutely doesn't come as any surprise. I want to start pulling some of the threads on this investment proposition in just a minute. But before I do, I want to come back to Tim. When you were working in Sky and you're looking at the sale of broadcast rights and working out what the valuation is for them, we've heard just through that short conversation that players and the fans are really important stakeholders in that context. And presumably, and certainly when I look back at some of the old Sky TV adverts, this idea that the fans are close to the pitch, that the players are faster, they're going into tackles much more firmly, they're scoring wonderful goals. That's the sort of stuff that really attracts a broadcaster to pay the big money that we've got on offer in not just across professional sport, but certainly across football.
Yeah, I mean, there's huge emotion around football, and I think you've got, when you're doing evaluation, that component of it's almost your how important is this right to my business? So are people going to subscribe because of this? And if you think about, if you're DAZN and you don't have any rights, and you would buy this right, you would be depending on this right to drive all of that subscription. And so you really have to understand that intensity of fandom. And I think you're, and I think that's a real question with what I would call almost for sure a secondary right in football right now, because it hasn't been proven as a primary right. And I cannot see a situation where this would trump the domestic leagues as at the top of a customer agenda. And then whenever you're looking at secondary leagues, then it becomes, it's additive rather than actually making that big of a difference for somebody who's already established, like a Sky Sports or Canal Plus Sport in France. And for a new company, or for a company that doesn't have any rights, you're making a huge bet that, hey, I'm going to spend $300 million for something, and I hope that people come to subscribe for it, even though it doesn't exist and there's no way to prove that there's a fan base that already exists. And that becomes the real tricky question.
Yeah, I'm just thinking now, kind of, if we, again, I'm not delaying this investment conversation deliberately. I just keep getting all these other thoughts in my mind about where this is going. And I know we've got some people that have tuned in that follow, we call lower league clubs, particularly in the football pyramid in the United Kingdom, or in England in particular. And what we've had since the advent of the Premier League is all of the money going in at the very top, at the elite end of the game. Some of it filters through solidarity payments. I think Kieran mentioned that some of the tenets of the European Super League was supposed to show increased solidarity payments through the system. But what we've got, and it's quantifiable, is the gap that's emerged between the haves and the have-nots has obviously established itself, and it's probably got much, much bigger over the last few years. So when we talk about football in this context, should we be talking about football as a pyramid, where it serves itself and it helps itself and it grows incrementally through that way? Or do you think that we have a situation where those top few clubs are so important from a broadcaster and a sponsorship and commercial partner perspective that it is simply dominating all of the discussion in the finances of football? And Tim might want to come in first on that, but I've opened everybody's mics up, so feel free to jump in.
Yeah, there's, I think you're seeing just so much money in sports right now, and you're seeing all these investment vehicles. There's more than 100 investment funds in the U.S. now. These things called SPACs, special purpose acquisition. I can't remember what the C is, but they cut their media and sport. There's been 45 total investments, and there's still something like 14 billion of committed money to media and sport that has yet to be invested. And I think it's an interesting question, because I think it's going to make fans more and more suspicious that everything is just about the owners and the money and at least in U.S. sports, you have collective bargaining agreements, which means nothing like the ESL could ever exist without the players first agreeing to it. And it's interesting to say, what's the knock-on effect for fans? What's the knock-on effect for players? Players may demand, I want more power.
Yeah. Ro, Kieran, Faye, anything you want to add to that?
No, I mean, I think certainly from an investment perspective, absolutely. I think, when this all happened, I kind of thought, is this going to have a knock-on effect, in terms of external factors influencing purely business decisions? But actually, I think it's probably, hopefully going to go the other way, actually, that actually shows that, the one thing I thought, especially coming out of COVID, was that a lot of this investment funding would just be used to bridge gaps, and, going to the purpose behind some of these clubs sort of joining on was because, they were suffering shortfalls and deficits. There's no doubt about it. Football clubs make money, but they also spend a lot of money. And actually, what we really need to be doing as part of this sort of investment focus in sport is actually looking at how to make organisations more efficient financially as well. And I think that's a lot of this debate is focused on that as well, because it's not just about making more money and accessing more money. It's about using that money in the right way. And in sport, that way should be going directly back into the game and into the development of sport and progressing that. And I think there is still this tricky line that we're walking right now, where there's a lot of organisations that are struggling post COVID, and they're just going to bridge the gap with this money, which we absolutely don't want to go down the route of.
Yeah, I know Kieran's going to have a few ideas about this in a minute, so I'm going to give Faye the opportunity first. I know you were supposed to be on holiday this week, and you've obviously been called in to do a whole bunch of reporting around this new idea that always breaks at the worst possible time. I'm sure we've all felt that this week, actually. Faye, did you get a sense when you were doing some of these reports that there was an understanding of these financial inequalities that exist, this chasing of revenue that we're being fed at the moment, and Tim's highlighted a bit of that. Is there a general understanding that football finances need to change from a regulatory or at least an operational perspective, or is this all about trying to generate something that is simply going to take football away from its heartlands?
I think football fans aren't quite aware of how bad the situation is. I mean, certainly in the Championship, I think they are, and it definitely feels like a haves and have-nots in the Premier League, and how much money you need in order to get promoted to the Premier League, and this cycle that, you know, it is currently there, which is, you know, what this model would have brought in, what this Super League would have brought in, is basically no threat of relegation for these big clubs, which would have reduced the need for massive spending on the biggest operating expenses that clubs have, which is player wages and transfer fees. And so that's what they were kind of thinking. But I don't know whether or not fans actually quite realise. It seems sometimes, and this isn't, I don't want to be in the slightest bit disrespectful, because there are so many fans out there who know so much about what's going on, and more than most people. They know, you know, their clubs inside out. But there are a kind of generic football fan that just is there for the football and doesn't really think about the business side of it. And things like this come to the fore, and they sit up and listen, because they haven't quite realised. Everybody just has this assumption that football, and particularly Premier League football, is, you know, a cash cow, and there's just, you know, money everywhere, and that's not the case. And I think once fans are kind of shown that, I mean, when you talk about some of the money, I don't think people can quite comprehend some of it in lots of ways, and that makes it difficult. But certainly in terms of the fans that we speak to at TalkSport, it's greed is mentioned a lot, but it tends to be quite black and white in terms of the money side of the big six having the money and other people not, and that making the competition imbalanced. But yeah, I mean, from as a fan of a Championship club, I certainly know the state that the Championship is in, and that if these kind of things continue, and the massive amounts of operating expenses that clubs have continue to rise and actually overtake revenues or make the margins very small, I don't think, you know, well, we all know that's not sustainable, but perhaps football fans are starting to realise that now, and when they're seeing their season tickets going up and various other things going on with their clubs, they're starting to think, hang on a minute. And particularly post-pandemic, well, I know we're not post-pandemic, that's wishful thinking, but, you know, when we eventually get to that stage, there are going to be a lot of people who've lost their jobs, and a lot of people who can't afford the astronomical prices that these clubs are charging. And, you know, sometimes we've looked at the product this season, and the product's not even worth it, really, if you'd have been at some of these games. So, you know, I think there's probably, this week has brought a new awareness, I would say.
I saw Kieran in the corner of my eye there, kind of nodding his head, and Rise smiling here and there. Kieran, come on, you and I have discussed this in the past. We've published some stuff actually on the frailty of football finances that have been exposed as a consequence of COVID. But for the layman or layperson football fan, what's your take on football finances in general? What is the nub of the problem?
It's an inability of the industry to control costs. And why is that inability to control costs there? First of all, it's a case of when worlds collide. We have some owners of clubs in the Championship, and the Championship is the most crazy basket case in European football. Now, Faye supports Luton Town. she knows Gary Sweet, one of the owners. I know Gary Sweet. I've had him on the show. He's absolutely fantastic. He says, we set a budget, we stick to our budget, and we live with the consequences. Then at the same time, you have other owners in that division who are seeking the glory route, because for them, a football club is a trophy asset, and you can only really get the rewards of that trophy if you get promoted to the Premier League. Therefore, their reaction to cost control is, that's not what we're not interested in that. And if there is any form of legislation, or if there is any form of cost constraint, we will use our damnedest to circumvent those rules. We've seen that with Sheffield Wednesday and Derby County and Aston Villa and Reading and Birmingham, all of whom have sold the grounds in order to generate profits. We've got the crazy situations of clubs being sponsored by taxi companies that own no taxis in order to simply generate extra revenues. And when that is the mentality and the culture of the owners, and ultimately this all comes down to the owners. Why is there not a wage cap in the Championship or the Premier League? It's because the owners of the club have voted against that. So football finances are precarious in English football in particular, because there are too many owners who are not like Gary Sweet, who are not like Andy Holt, who are not like Mark and Nicola Palios, who think of football as not being a business. It is this trophy asset. And then also I think we've got to look at ourselves as fans, because I and you, I suspect, we both go on many shows, and one of the things I'm constantly asked is, why isn't the owner spending £50 million on a centre forward? It's do we need to be indulged as fans? And then of course, as soon as the player arrives, football's ruined the game. He's on too much wages. Well, it was you who wanted him to come there in the first place. And the gaps between the divisions for me, the gap between the Premier League and the Championship, and then the Championship and League One, and then if we take a look at League Two and the National League, they encourage this arms race in terms of wages. I also monitor Scottish football. Stenhousemuir announced their results this morning from COVID. They made a profit. Why? Because the gaps between the Scottish divisions are so much narrower that clubs say, well, if we do get promoted, that's great. And if we don't, well, we've lost out on £100,000 in additional revenues, as opposed to 95 million. Address the gaps within football and you solve the problems. But that requires a willingness for some form of democratization of income. Nobody's saying that Liverpool should earn less than Accrington Stanley. Everybody accepts that Manchester United is a fantastic institution. It's been the biggest single private sector employer in Manchester for many years. It's done many great achievements, but it doesn't have to have 3.5 times the revenue of all the non-6 clubs in the rest of the Premier League. If it was 1.5, they'd still survive. So until that changing culture occurs, then the system that we have at present is going to repeat itself, and the risks of administration and the financial challenges within the game will maintain.
Yeah, I'm reflecting on a couple of phone-ins that I've been involved with, actually, and you go on to the phone in, you explain to the presenter that Club X is in financial difficulty, the selling price isn't higher than the cost, they can't pay the debts as they fall due, the two functional first rules of any financial management course, I would suspect. That long term, if that particular club doesn't do something to arrest its alarming loss-making potential, it will ultimately at some point fold. And then what comes next? The next fan phones in and says, well, when are we going to sign this player on 20 million quid and on these wages? And you kind of want to pull your hair out to a certain extent. I'm surprised that you and I have both got hair left, if I'm honest, because it is a crazy situation.
The number of terms I've heard, you need to speculate to accumulate. And I go, no, because that's the equivalent of saying, when you get paid at the end of this month, spend all of your money on scratch cards. Now, you might win something, but the chances are you're going to be starving for the rest of for the following month. And trying to teach simple financial principles to fans, because we fell in love with football not because of the balance sheets. I'm the only person in the country that fell in love with football club balance sheets. The rest of the country have got it right.
Yeah, I like that. It's a nice analogy, and it links us nicely actually to the last thing I want to cover on this this webinar, which is the investment potential of football. And I think what we've painted there is a picture that, you know, the European Super League didn't involve its fans as a key stakeholder that had actually quite a lot of legitimacy in the decision-making process. We've also unearthed some issues with regard to the finances of football and the way that those clubs run. Yet we still do see some fairly hefty investments coming into football. JP Morgan were ready to underwrite this European Super League. We hear stories upon stories of private equity involvement in professional sport and potentially in football. So just very briefly, folks, and I'll probably start with Ro if I can do first. What's attracting investors to sport? What is it that football in particular has that these investors are really keen on utilising, if you like? Because actually, the model that we've painted there is one that probably won't yield a huge amount of profit at the end of the year, and will probably require much more investment than it will do money back out to the investment company.
Well, ironically, given that we've just talked a lot about how the fans and the players weren't consulted, I mean, for me, that goes back to the point that sport's all about passion, and it's just got this unique relationship with the fan. So, you know, that holds so much value for any kind of organisation. I just think it's the way in which and that's actually, you know, if you talk about sort of the future coming out of COVID, what everyone's focusing on, it really is about how can we capitalize on this in a much better way. And I think that's really a really key aspect. I think if you are investing in sports, you have to have a passion for sports. I mean, if you want a pure business ROI, then, you know, don't come to sport. What we are trying to do is change that. You know, if you look at the sort of the difference in the last 40, 50 years, you know, sport used to be a hobby. It's a business. There's a reason that we're all sat on this panel and we've got people listening into it, because it is now business. There are just still some shortcomings that we need to address. One of those being the mismanagement of finances. You know, in some levels there's still some corruption. There's all these sorts of alternative issues that we're still trying to iron out, and we have made progress. But I think we still need to make a lot more. And I think that's another thing that's come out of this. You know, I go back to the point that I made before. I do believe football clubs make money. It's just that they also spend a lot of money. And so ultimately it's about how can we do that educational piece around, and that's where the UEFAs and the FIFAs of the world are important, you know, and bringing in financial fair play rules and sort of equalising that a lot more. Maybe we won't see a need for a Super League because there'll be much more equality across the field.
It's a really nice point to finish that on, actually. What I'm going to do now is something that's a little bit cheeky. Anybody that's been on a panel with me before knows I always try and throw in a left field question at the end. So there's been a little bit of chat on our comments box down the right hand side, and one or two questions that have come in through the duration of this chat. The European Super League was pitched as this saviour to some of these clubs' finances in European football, and let's assume that some of that money will have trickled back down across domestic leagues. But we've also heard a lot about from Ro, the investment proposition that is potentially built around sport. We've heard about broadcast rights that are potentially available. We've also heard about the fact that clubs spend more money than they earn. So if I was to put you all on the spot, and I'm going to go through, I'm going to come to Kieran first, and then Faye, Tim, and then Ro. What would be the single thing you would do to support sustainable club finances? Sorry, Kieran, you're first.
Okay. I would have something similar to what we see in the NFL and the NBA, where revenues are effectively shared. By all means, give the more successful clubs a lion's share. So, for example, in the NFL, 60% of matchday revenues held by the home club, 40% goes into a pool and redistributed. All merchandising is split evenly. Then all of a sudden, Perez's claim that people are not watching matches, it no longer applies because you've got a more competitive football.
Yeah, good stuff. I happen to agree with you on that, actually. I think Perez was very disingenuous with his comments the other day about the lack of competition in La Liga, because it was Real Madrid that created an unequal competition in the first place. So Faye, I'm going to come to you next, if that's okay.
They have very short memories, don't they? Some of these owners. Mine is kind of more in terms of structure. I think the clubs have to integrate fans into the ownership model. Not quite sure about going as far as the German model, but certainly there has to be, it works from our point of view in terms of Luton. We have owners who are fans, a consortium of fans or owners, and it works in other clubs. And I think it's really important because they do have a check on reality. And I feel many of these clubs, for all the reasons that all three of the panelists that have laid out, don't really have a check on reality. They need that, and fans bring them that. And then perhaps, we might get some form of financial stability with that.
Great stuff. Tim, your turn.
Yeah. So, I mean, what's interesting is we haven't really talked about the revenue side. So if you look at the domestic TV deals in France, in Italy, and in the UK, at least France after their deal fell apart, all these things are coming in lower than the previous deal, which suggests that if there is to be continued kind of irresponsibility financially, and if it's ego driven, then it's only going to get worse because the top line is going to be harder to hold. So I think I'd go back to something that Kieran said, is some sort of US style salary cap or luxury tax or something that kind of punishes clubs with a kind of collective mechanism run by a league that says you cannot do this, or if you do, you face penalty of X from a spend point of view. Because otherwise, I don't think there's a really successful major league in the world that doesn't enforce something like this. And you'll see, you're even hearing this in terms of F1, in terms of what you can do from an investment point of view there as well. And if they're capping what people can spend, then clearly anybody can.
Yeah, it's a really interesting proposition. You look at the American model and how it works with the system. It de-risks a lot of the investment decision, doesn't it? So if you're trying to borrow some money, if you're trying to leverage something, because you've got those limits on risk, it's sometimes easier to do. But I think someone's just popped it in the comments box, actually. The real challenge in a European competition is you have those domestic arrangements and then those European arrangements, trying to equalise that as a system. I think all three of you were onto something really strong there. Ro, I came to you last for the opening question, so I'm going to give you the closing or final word, if you like, on this. So give me your one thing you might do if you were an administrator in the football business to solve this financial problem, and then your kind of general close down of the Super League conversation.
I mean, I think it's been touched upon already, but I guess with my lawyer's hat on, is more around the sort of financial fair play regulation and really going to the fact that this isn't just a normal business venture, that you can take all these risks and just fold the company that goes wrong. Actually, there should be regulations in place so that you can't spend more than you're earning. You can't put these clubs at risk in the same way that you would a normal business venture. So I guess my point is really look at this as a unique proposition and focus on the fact that it is about the fans, it's about the players, it's about the community. It's much more than just making money.
Really sage points there. I think my dog's just decided to shout at the builder. Really, really good points there. And I think that whole fan engagement piece has really come through in this conversation. The value and the importance of broadcast rights, but also that we structurally need some sort of reform to change the culture, I think, of some of the ownership models and some of the way that football is run, particularly in England, but also right across mainland Europe. And of course, we always look, or I certainly look as somebody that teaches this stuff, at the US model and how it compares to the European one, and that idea of risk and reward. Of course, we've got a winner takes all scenario, haven't we, in most professional team sports, which drives some of that. I think you described it, Faye, as greed that a lot of the fans have been talking about, and it's there certainly for a long time. Folks, listen, it's been an extraordinary hour. I can't quite believe I've managed to almost moderate the 4 or 5 of us, because I've had a few things that I've wanted to say as well. On behalf of InSport and also all of the audience that have dialed in today and will no doubt listen back to the recording, thanks ever so much for joining us. It's been an absolute privilege for me to host this panel. Some of those things we talked about at the very end of that that webinar were all around the investment decisions, protection against risk, the types of conditions that investors might look at. And here's the shameless plug from me as the host for this webinar. If you look at the very bottom of the screen, there's a green button. We launched this week our series on private equity in sport. We've got a great group of speakers lined up for that. So if you're interested in learning a bit more about private equity and certainly the emergence of private equity in professional sport, then click on that link, have a look, see what we've got planned over the next few weeks. For now, though, I think that'll do from us. I know there are a few more comments coming in on the chat box. We'll try and harvest a few of those back at HQ and answer some of them in the future. Folks, as I said before we came live, when I end this broadcast, you are unceremoniously going to be kicked out of the system. It's meant as no offence, and I've really appreciated your time today. So to you and everybody else that's listened, thanks very much. Take care. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.